We all make tough choices, but when you're sitting in the Oval Office as President of the United States, the decisions you make will affect millions of people. Now, as Americans are about to decide who's going to be our next president, we're going to look into the heart of some of the most crucial presidential decisions that shook our world, and still do. Imagine it's 1963, and you're Lyndon Johnson. Suddenly, you're president after a national tragedy. President John Kennedy has just been assassinated in, of all places, your home state of Texas. Now everyone is waiting for your first move. The nation is divided over civil rights for Black Americans. Something must be done, and now it's your call.
It is 1963, and Black Americans are struggling against the racial injustice and widespread violence inflicted upon them. Their outcry has led President John F. Kennedy to propose a sweeping new civil rights bill. On November 22, 1963, the president's vision of the future, including his hope to end segregation, is about to be crushed. The nation is stunned, and the fate of Kennedy's civil rights bill is now in the hands of a former senator from Texas.
This is a sad time for all people. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help.
At the end of that terrible day, as Lyndon Johnson returns to his residence, he knows he must make a crucial decision that will affect his entire presidency and the nation he must now lead.
He lay in his pajamas in this vast bed. We watched television till about 4 in the morning. The commentators all over the world were inspecting this alien cowboy who was now the leader of the free world. Here's a man who was president for only 12 hours, and because of his 24 years in the Congress and as vice president, had observed what presidents did right and what they did wrong. And he meant to use that catalog of experience to let him be, as he said, the greatest American president that he could be.
President Lyndon Johnson is faced with a dilemma. Civil rights is the nation's biggest domestic issue, but to take further action could set off a political firestorm, especially in the South.
Kennedy in 1960 had given the impression when he was running for president that he would be, if elected, a great civil rights president. He said, if I'm elected, I'm going to end discrimination against Black Americans with a stroke of the pen.
But by 1963, Kennedy had done little to end segregation. He didn't want to alienate white Southern politicians who had been firmly opposed to granting civil rights to blacks, politicians he needed for his other programs.
Both white and colored cannot be permitted to live and work in peace and harmony as we all want to do.
Only by the summer of 1963 did Kennedy really act.
The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it is not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
The proposed civil rights bill would make it illegal for public places such as restaurants, hotels, and movie theaters to ban black customers.
Can I be admitted?
No, sir, you cannot be admitted.
Why?
I am not going to serve you.
Because of my race?
I'm not going to serve you.
Because of my race.
Move on.
But in the wake of his speech, Kennedy's popularity dropped, and the violence against blacks continued.
Civil rights was possible, and not just possible, it was needed by the country. Hundreds of people had protested in every way. They'd been met by brutality. Hoses turned on, buses set afire, some people killed.
Kennedy's civil rights bill had been languishing, locked up in the Senate. President Kennedy was unable to spring it loose.
I heard it on the radio that the President of the United States had been assassinated. I was shocked. I was concerned, like many of us, that with the loss of President Kennedy and now Lyndon Johnson as president, this will interrupt the movement toward equality and justice.
I don't think anybody could have been sure with Kennedy's assassination what Johnson would do. His previous attitudes in the Senate from the time he first came there was one of accommodating the racial inclinations of his strongest supporters in Texas. And his public statements were very negative about civil rights.
The northern white person makes often an intellectual change. But for a person who is a Southerner, who grew up in the kind of climate that Lyndon Johnson did, has to make not only an intellectual change, but an emotional change.
I've always had a notion that I would rather have a converted Southerner on my side than a wobbly Northern liberal.
Johnson knew all of the black leaders at the time, Roy Wilkins and Dr. Martin Luther King, Dorothy Height. He knew them all. And I think at first there was a lack of trust. But later on, they began to realize that this man was made of steel.
The evening of his second day in office, President Johnson receives a phone call from a concerned Martin Luther King.
I think one of the great tributes that we can pay in memory of President Kennedy is to try to enact some of the great progressive policies that he sought to initiate.
Well, I'm going to support them all, and you can count on that, and I'm going to do my best to get other men to do likewise, and I'll have to have y'all's help. I never needed more than I do now.
Well, you know you have it, and just feel free to call on us for anything.
Thank you so much, Martin.
For Johnson, it was almost like the devil on one side and the angel on the other. The angel was saying, you have the chance to do more for civil rights than any president in history. The devil was saying, don't throw it away, Lyndon. Be cautious. Don't do something that's not only going to get you in trouble, but may cause you to be defeated when you have to run for election in 1964.
I took an oath, Johnson would later say. But for millions of Americans, I was still illegitimate, a naked man with no presidential covering, a pretender to the throne, an illegal usurper.
He knew that he was into office as a white Southerner. A lot of people were very suspicious. He looked back on his record, and he was running for the Senate from Texas, and in certain ways, was fairly liberal. But on civil rights, he gives these speeches that are essentially white supremacist speeches.
When running for Congress in 1948, Johnson had told his constituents the civil rights program was a farce and a sham, an effort to set up a police state in the guise of liberty. I am opposed to that program.
Where Johnson came from, the Southern roots were deep and abiding. So he understood with great clarity the dangers, the electoral dangers of being out in front on a civil rights bill. President Johnson knew with unerring instinct that to fight for human justice and civil rights in America would mark him as a candidate for defeat. He understood how the South worked, its beliefs, its culture. He was a Southerner.
His experience as a Southerner meant that he probably felt it and realized it about the civil rights issues and about segregation, about the treatment of people, especially in the South. He knew exactly what was happening.
I've heard President Johnson tell racial stories, and I've heard him talk like a Southerner. But the Southern senators were his friends, and it seems to me quite natural that he would talk to them in a way that would try to separate himself from civil rights liberals.
Neither segregationists nor civil rights leaders could be sure about the new president's position on civil rights. But Johnson makes his tough call just 5 days after Kennedy's death in a stirring speech to Congress.
No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long.
Johnson has made his decision.
I remember that speech, and I remember the words of President Johnson. That was very reassuring.
If President Johnson hadn't immediately endorsed the Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy had put in and made a big deal out of it, I think he would have lost a good deal of support. He would have regained the South, which would have helped him in terms of renomination as president. Well, I think he was taking a risk either way.
Washington feels the impact of his announcement immediately. Johnson goes to work on Congress, using his political muscle to get the Civil Rights Bill passed. He knows his strong stance has angered many of his Southern friends in the Senate, friends whose support he will need in the coming election of 1964.
Johnson was very conscious of the fact that one thing he could do in history was to be the president that got Southerners nervous about civil rights to accept civil rights. And one way he felt he could do that, especially in private, was to use the N-word, which was sort of a way of showing, I haven't changed that much, don't think I'm a turncoat.
I heard him say to Paul Douglas, Paul, well, we're going to get the Civil Rights Bill up at 2 o'clock, and I want you to be there. And Johnson walked down and turned the corner, and there was Sam Ervin of North Carolina on the phone. Johnson rapped on the phone booth, Sam, we're going to get the nigger bill up at 2 o'clock.
At the time, Senator Richard Russell of Georgia is just about the most powerful person in the Senate, and he's dead set against the Civil Rights Bill.
We are not yet ready to surrender in our opposition to this bill, which we feel is a perversion of the American way of life.
With great affection, and the president grabbed Russell by the shoulder and he says, Dick, I love you and I owe you. If you hadn't made me leader, I would never have become vice president. If I hadn't been vice president, I wouldn't be sitting where I am today. So all that I am, I owe you, which is why I want to tell you, don't get in my way on this Civil Rights Bill or I'll run you down. And I remember Russell, in those rolling accents of his Georgia countryside, said, well, Mr. President, he said, you may very well do that. But if you do, you're not only going to lose the election, you're going to lose the South forever. As Johnson said in another soft voice, Dick, if that's the price I've got to pay, I'll gladly pay it.
The key to the bill was the Republican leader, Everett Dirksen of Illinois. He went to Dirksen and said, Ev, I know you've got some doubts about the Civil Rights Bill, but look at it this way. 100 years from now, if you're for this bill, Americans will know only two names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. And Dirksen, being a bottomless well for flattery, liked what he heard, supported the bill. However, probably not too many kids these days know the name of Everett Dirksen.
Johnson had a rich appreciation of human foibles. He just delighted in talking to people who sounded highly moral and were living a salacious life off stage.
One particular senator is on the floor trying to block the Civil Rights Bill with a filibuster.
Humphrey told Johnson a senator was doing this, and Johnson said, my God, that guy's got a Negro mistress. How can he do that? And Humphrey said, I had no idea that he had a mistress of any kind.
Johnson orders that a call be made to the woman in question.
And a few minutes later, the phone rings in the Democratic cloakroom. The senator gets on the phone. Humphrey's positioned to listen to him, and he hears this guy saying, yes, dear, no, 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 but and then finally saying, I didn't know it meant that much to you. And then walking back on the floor and attacking the people who were against the bill and saying that now he understood it, he was going to vote to break the filibuster.
It's the day of decision on Capitol Hill as the U.S. Senate clears the way for the Civil Rights Bill by voting to limit debate on the measure. GOP leader Everett Dirksen left and Democratic whip Hubert Humphrey mustered 4 votes more than the necessary majority.
I think the key to Johnson being so driven was, after his serious heart attack in 1955, Johnson always assumed that he would die before the age of 65. So when he was working for a civil rights bill, in his brain was, I'd better do it today because I might die tomorrow.
This is my 9th anniversary of my heart attack today.
Oh, is that so? Well, this is
Johnson pushes through this major step on the road to racial equality. With Martin Luther King at his side, he signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
When you look back from emancipation to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a long time.